The story had held us round the fire sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as, on Christmas Eve in an old house, a strange tale should essentially be, I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to say that it was the only case he had met in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. The case, I may mention, was that of an apparition in just such an old house as had gathered us for the occasion, an appearance of a dreadful kind to a little boy sleeping in the room with his mother and waking her up in terror of it, waking her not to dissipate his dread and soothe him to sleep again, but to encounter also herself before she had succeeded in doing so, the same sight that had shaken him. It was this observation that drew from Douglas, not immediately, but later in the evening, a reply that had the interesting consequence to which I call attention. Someone else told a story not particularly effective, which I saw he was not following. This I took for a sign that he had himself something to produce, and that we would only have to wait. We waited, in fact, until 2 nights later, but that same evening, before we scattered, he brought out what was in his mind. I quite agree, in regard to Griffin's ghost, or whatever it was, that its appearing first to the little boy at so tender an age adds a particular touch, but it's not the first occurrence of its charming kind that I know to have involved a child. If the child gives the effect of another turn of the screw, what do you say to 2 children? We say, of course, somebody explained, that they give 2 turns, although also that we want to hear about them. I can see Douglas there before the fire, to which he had got up to his back, looking down at his interlocutor, with his hands in his pockets. Nobody but me, till now, has ever heard "It's quite too horrible." This, naturally, was declared by several voices to give the thing the utmost price, and our friend, with the quiet art, prepared his triumph by turning his eyes over the rest of us and going on. "It's beyond everything. Nothing at all that I know touches it. For sheer terror?" I remember asking. He seemed to say it was not quite so simple as that, to be really at a loss how to qualify it. He passed his hand over his eyes, made a little wincing grimace. "For dreadfulness." "Oh, how delicious!" cried one of the women. He took no notice of her. He looked at me, but as if, instead of me, he saw what he spoke of. "For general uncanny ugliness and horror and pain." "Well then," I said, "just sit right down and begin." He turned round to the fire, gave a kick to a log, and watched at an instant. Then, as he faced us, "I can't begin. I shall have to send to town." There was an unanimous groan at this, and much reproach, after which, in his preoccupied way, he explained, "The story's not written. It's locked in a drawer. It has not been out for years. I could write to my man and enclose the key. He could send it down the packet as he finds it." It was to me in particular that he appeared to propound this. It appeared almost to appeal for aid, not to hesitate. He had broken down a thickness of ice, the formation of a mini winter, had his reasons for a long silence. The others resented postponement, but it was just his scruples that charmed me. I adjured him to write by the first post and to agree with us for an early hearing. Then I asked him if the experience in question had been his own. To this the answer was prompt. "Oh, thank God, no." "And this record of yours? You took the thing down?" "Nothing but the impression. I took that here." He tapped his heart. "I never lost it." "Then your manuscript?" "It is an old faded ink in the most beautiful hand." He hung fire again. a woman's. She has been dead for almost 20 years. She sent me the pages in question before she died. They were all listening now, and of course there was somebody to be arch, or at any rate, to draw inference. But if he also put inference by without a smile, it was also without irritation. She was the most charming person, but she was 10 years older than I. She was my sister's governess, he said quietly. She was the most agreeable woman I've ever known. In her position, she would have been worthy of any whatever. It was long ago, and this episode was long before. I was at Trinity, and I found her at home on my coming down the second summer. I was much here that year. It was a beautiful one, and we had, in her off hours, some strolls and talks in the garden. Talks in which she struck me as awfully clever and nice. Oh yes, don't grin. I liked her extremely, and I am glad to this day to think she liked me too. If she hadn't, she wouldn't have told me. If she had never told anyone. It wasn't simply that she said so, but that I knew she hadn't. I was sure. I could see. You'll easily judge why when you hear. Because the thing had been such a scare, he continued to fix me. You'll easily judge, he repeated. You will. I fixed him too. I see. She was in love. He laughed for the first time. You are cute. Yes, she was in love. That is, she had been. She came out. She couldn't tell her story without its coming out. I saw it, and she saw I saw it, but neither of us spoke of it. I remember the time and the place, the corner of the lawn, the shade of the great beeches, and the long, hot summer afternoon. It wasn't a scene for a shudder, but oh! He quitted the fire and dropped his back into the chair. You'll receive the packet Thursday morning? I inquired. Probably not till the second post. Well then, after dinner? You'll meet me here. He looked at us round again. Isn't anybody going? It was almost the tone of hope. Everybody will stay. I will, and I will, cried the ladies whose departure had been fixed. Mrs. Griffin, however, expressed the need for a little more light. Who was she in love with? The story will tell. I looked upon myself to reply. Oh, I can't wait for the story. The story won't tell, said Douglas, not in any literal, vulgar way. More's the pity, then. That's the only way I will ever understand. Won't you tell, Douglas? Somebody inquired. He sprang to his feet. Yes, tomorrow. Now I must go to bed. Good night. And tonight, and quickly catching up a candlestick, he left us slightly bewildered. From our end of the great brown hall, we heard his step on the chair, whereupon Mrs. Griffin spoke. Well, if I don't know who she was in love with, I know who he was. She was 10 years older, said her husband. Raison de plus at that age. It's rather nice, his long reticence. 40 years, Griffin put in. With this outbreak at last, the outbreak, I returned, will make a tremendous occasion of Thursday night. And so everyone agreed with me that, in the light of it, we lost all attention for everything else. The last story, however incomplete, and like the mere opening of a serial, had been told. We handshook and candle stuck, as somebody said, and went to bed. I knew the next day that the letter containing the key had, by the first post, gone off to his London apartments, but in spite of, or perhaps just on account of, the eventual diffusion of this knowledge, excuse me, we quite let him alone until after dinner, till such an hour of the evening, in fact, as best might accord with the kind of emotion on which our hopes were fixed. When he became as communicative as we could desire, and indeed gave us his best reason for doing so, we had it from him again before the fire in the hall, as we had had our mild wonders of the previous night. It appeared that the narrative had promised to read us really required for a proper intelligence in a few words of prologue. Let me say here distinctly, to have done with it, that this narrative, from such an exact transcript of my own, made much later, is what I shall presently give. Poor Douglas, before his death, when it was in sight, committed to me that the manuscript that had reached him on the third of these days, and that, on the same spot with immense effort, he began to read to our hushed little circle on the night of the 4th. The departing ladies who had said they would stay didn't, who had said they would stay didn't, of course, thank heaven, stay. They departed, in consequence of arrangements made, in a rage of curiosity, as they professed, produced by the touches with which they had already worked us up. But that only made his final little auditory more compact and select, kept it round the hearth, subject to a common thrill. The first of these touches conveyed that the written statement took up the tale at a point after it had, in manner, begun. The fact to be in possession of what was therefore that his old friend, the youngest of several daughters of a poor country person, had, at the age of 20, on taking service for the first time in the schoolroom, come up to London in trepidation to answer in person an advertisement that had already placed her in brief correspondence with the advertiser. This person proved, on presenting herself for judgment at a house in Harley Street that impressed her as vast and imposing, this prospective patron proved a gentleman, a bachelor in the prime of his life, such a figure as had never risen, save in a dream or an old novel, before a fluttered, anxious girl out of a Hampshire vicarage. One could easily fix his type. It never, happily, dies out. He was handsome and bold and pleasant, offhand and gay and kind. He struck her, inevitably, as gallant and splendid, but what took most of her all, and gave her courage, she afterward showed, was that he put the whole thing to her as a kind of favor, an obligation he should gratefully incur. She conceived him as a rich, but fearfully extravagant, saw all of him in a glow of high fashion, of looks, of expensive habits, of charming ways with women. He had, for his own town residence, a big house filled with the spoils of travel and the trophies of the chase, but it was to his country home, an old family place in Essex, that he wished her immediately to proceed. He had been left, by the death of their parents in India, a guardian to a small nephew and a small niece, children of a military brother, whom he had lost 2 years before. These children were, by the strangest of chances for a man in his position, a lone man without the right sort of experience or grain of patience, very heavily on his hands. It had all been a great worry, and on his own part, doubtless, a series of blunders, but he immensely pitied the poor chicks, and had done all he could, and in particular sent them down to his other house, the proper place for them being, of course, the country, and he kept them there from the first with the best people he could find to look after them, parting even with his own servants to wait on them, and going down himself whenever he might, to see how they were doing. The awkward thing was that they had practically no other relations, and that their own affairs took up all his time. He had put them in possession of Bligh, who was healthy and secure, and had placed at the head of their little establishment, but below stairs only, an excellent woman, Mrs. Gross, who was sure his visitor would like, and who had formerly been a maid to his mother. She was now housekeeper, and was also acting for the time being as superintendent to the little girl, of whom, without children of her own, she was, by good luck, extremely fond. There were plenty of people to help, but of course the young lady who should go down to the governess would be in supreme authority. She would also have, in holidays, to look after the small boy, who had been for a term at school. Young, he was to be sent, but what else could be done? And who, as the holidays were about to begin, would be back from one day to the other. There had been for the two children at first a young lady whom they had the misfortune to lose. She had done for them quite beautifully. She was a most respectable person till her death, the great awkwardness of which had precisely left no alternative but the school for little Miles. Mrs. Gross, then, in the way of manners and things, had done as she could for Flora, and there were, further, a cook, a housemaid, a dairywoman, an old pony, an old groom, and an old gardener, all likewise thoroughly respectable. So far Douglas had presented his picture when someone put a question. And what did the former governess die of? And of so much respectability? Our friend's answer was prompt. That will come out. I don't anticipate. Excuse me, I thought that was just what you are doing. In her successor's place, I suggested, I should have wished to learn if the office brought with it necessary danger to life. Douglas completed my thought. She did wish to learn, and she did learn. You shall hear tomorrow what she learned. Meanwhile, of course, the prospect struck her as slightly grim. She was young, untried, nervous. It was a vision of serious duties and little company, of really great loneliness. She hesitated, took a couple of days to consult and consider, but the salary offered and much exceeded her modest measure, and on the second interview she faced the music she engaged, and Douglas, with this, made pause for that, for the benefit of company, moved me to throw in, the moral of which was of course the seduction exercised by the splendid young man. She succumbed to it. He got up, and as he had done the night before, he went to the fire, gave a stir to a log with his foot, then stood a moment with his back to us. She saw him only twice. Yes, but that's just the beauty of her passion. A little to my surprise, on this, Douglas turned round to me. It was the beauty of it. There were others, he went on, who hadn't succumbed. He told her frankly all his difficulty, that for several applicants the conditions had been prohibitive. They were, somehow, simply afraid. It sounded dull. It sounded strange, all the more so because of his main condition, which was that she should never trouble him, but never, neither appeal nor complain nor write about anything, only meet all the questions herself, receive all the moneys from his solicitor, take over the whole thing, and let him alone. She promised to do this. She mentioned to me that when, for a moment, disburdened, delighted, she held her hand, thanking her for the sacrifice, she already felt rewarded. But was that all her reward? One of the ladies asked. She never saw him again. Oh, said the lady, which, as our friend immediately left us again, was the only other word of importance contributed to the subject till, the next night, by the corner of the hearth in the best chair, he opened the faded red cover of a thin, old-fashioned, gilt-edged album. The whole thing took, indeed, more nights than one, but on the first occasion the same lady put another question. What is your title? I haven't one. Oh, I have, I said, but Douglas, without heeding me, had begun to read with a fine clearness that was like a rendering to the ear of the beauty of the author's hand. Chapter 1. I remember the whole beginning as a succession of flights and drops, a little seesaw of the right throbs and the wrong. After rising in town to meet his appeal, I had, at all events, a couple of very bad days. I found myself doubtful again. I felt indeed sure that I had made a mistake. In this state of mind, I spent the long hours of bumping, swinging coach that carried me to the stopping place at which I was to be met by a vehicle from the house. This convenience, I was told, had been ordered, and I found toward the close of June afternoon a commodious fly in waiting for me. Driving at that hour, on a lovely day, through a country to which the summer sweetness seemed to offer me a friendly welcome, my fortitude mounted afresh, and as we turned into the avenue, I encountered a reprieve that was probably but a proof of the point to which it had sunk. I suppose I had expected, or had dreaded, something so melancholy that what greeted me was a good surprise. I remember as a most pleasant impression of the broad, clear front, its open windows and fresh curtains, and the pair of maids looking out. I remember the lawn, and the bright flowers, and the crunch of my wheels on the gravel, and the clustered tree tops over which the rooks circled and cawed in the golden sky. The scene had a greatness that had made it a different affair from my own scant home, and there immediately appeared at the door, with a little girl in her hand, a civil person who dropped me decent a curtsy as if I had been the mistress or a distinguished visitor. I had received in Harley Street a narrower notion of the place, and that, as I recalled it, made me think of the proprietor, still more a gentleman, suggested that what I was to enjoy might be something beyond this promise. I had no drop again until the next day, for I was carried triumphantly through the following hours by my introduction to the younger of my pupils. The little girl who accompanied Mrs. Gross appeared to me on the spot a creature so charming as to make it a great fortune to have to do with her. She was the most beautiful child I had ever seen, and afterward I wondered what my employer had not told me more of her. I slept little that night. I was much too excited, and this astonished me too, I recollect, remained with me, adding to my sense of the liberality with which I was treated. The large, impressive room, one of the best in the house, the great state bed, as I almost felt it, the full-figured draperies, the long glasses in which, for the first time, I could see myself from head to foot, all struck me, like the extraordinary charm of my small charge, as to so many things thrown in. It was thrown in as well from the first moment that I should get on with Mrs. Gross in a relation over which, on my way in the coach, I fear I had rather brooded. The only thing, indeed, that this early outlook might have made me shrink again was the clear circumstance of her being so glad to see me. I perceived within half an hour that she was so glad, stout, simple, plain, clean, wholesome woman, as to be positively on her guard against showing it too much. I wondered even then a little why she would not wish to show it, and that, with reflection, with suspicion, might of course have made me uneasy. But it was a comfort that there would be no uneasiness in a connection with anything so beatific as the radiant image of my little girl, the vision of whose angelic beauty had probably more than anything else to do with the restlessness that, before morning, made me several times rise and wander about my room to take in the whole picture in prospect, to watch from my open window the faint summer dawn, to look at such proportions of the rest of the house as I could catch, and to listen, while in the fading dusk the first birds began to twitter, for the possible recurrence of a sound or two, less natural and not without, but within, as I had fancied I had heard. There had been a moment when I believed I recognized, faint and far, the cry of a child. There had been another when I found myself just consciously starting at the first passage before my door of a light footstep. But these fancies were not marked enough to be thrown off, and it is only the light, or the gloom, I should rather say, of the other subsequent matters that they now come back to me. To watch, teach, form a little Flora would too evidently be the making of a happy and useful life. It had been agreed between us downstairs that after the first occasion that I should have her as a matter of course at night, her small white bed being already arranged to that end in my room. What I had undertaken was the whole care of her, and just as she had remained, just as this last time, with Mrs. Gross, only as an effect of our consideration for my inevitable strangeness and her natural timidity. In spite of this timidity, which the child herself, in the oddest way in the world, had been perfectly frank and brave about without allowing it, without a sign of uncomfortable consciousness, with the deep, sweet serenity and indeed of one of the Raphael's holy infants, to be discussed, to be imputed to her, and to determine us, I feel quite sure she would presently like me. It was part of what I already liked Mrs. Gross herself for, the pleasure I could see her feel in my admiration and my wonder as I sat at supper with four tall candles in my pupil, and a high chair and bib brightly facing me, between them over bread and milk. There were naturally things that in Flora's presence could pass between us only as excuse me, only as prodigious and gratified looks, only obscure and roundabout allusions. And the little boy, does he look like her? Is he too very remarkable? One wouldn't flatter a child. Oh, miss, most remarkable. If you think well of this one. And she stood there with a plate in her hand, beaming at our companion, who looked from one of us to the other with placid, heavenly eyes that contained nothing to check us. Yes, if I do, you will be carried away by the little gentleman. Well, that, I think, is what I came for, to be carried away. I'm afraid, however, I remember feeling the impulse to add, I'm rather easily carried away. I was carried away in London. I can still see Mrs. Gross's broad face as she took this in Harley Street. In Harley Street. Well, miss, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. Oh, I've no pretension, I could laugh, to being the only one. My other pupil, at any rate, as I understand, comes back tomorrow. Not tomorrow, Friday, miss. He arrives, as you did, by the coach, under the care of the guard, and is to be met by the same carriage. I forthwith expressed that the proper, as well as the pleasant and friendly thing would be, therefore, that on the arrival of the public conveyance I should be in waiting for him with his little sister, an idea in which Mrs. Gross concurred so heartily that I somehow took her manner as a kind and comforting pledge, never falsified, thank heaven, that we should on every question be quite at one. Oh, I was glad she was glad I was there. What I felt the next day was, I suppose, nothing that could fairly be called a reaction from the cheer of my arrival. It was probably at most only a slight oppression produced by a fuller measure of the scale. As I walked round them, gazed up at them, took them in, of my new circumstances, they had, as it were, an extent and mass for which I had not been prepared, and in the presence of which I found myself freshly a little scared, as well as a little proud. Lessons in this agitation certainly suffered some delay. I reflected that my first duty was, by the gentlest arts I could contrive, to win the child into the sense of knowing me. I spent the day with her out of doors. I arranged with her, to her great satisfaction, that it should be she only, who might show me the place. She showed it step by step and room by room, and secret by secret, with droll, delightful, childish talk about it, and with the result, in half an hour, of our becoming immense friends. Young as she was, I was struck, throughout our little tour, with her confidence and courage, with the way and in empty chambers and dull corridors, on crooked staircases that made me pause, and even on the summit of an old machicolated square tower that made me dizzy, her morning music, her disposition to tell me so many more things than she asked, rang out and led me on. I had not seen Bly since the day I left it, and I dare say that to my older and more informed eyes it would now appear sufficiently contracted. But as my little conductress, with her hair of gold and her frock of blue, danced before me, round corners and patterned down passages, I had the view of a castle of romance inhabited by a rosy sprite, such a place as would somehow, for the diversion of the young idea, take all color out of story books and fairy tales. Wasn't it just a storybook over which I had fallen a doze in a dream? No, it was a big, ugly, antique but convenient house, embodying a few features of a building still older, half replaced and half utilized, in which I had the fancy of our being almost as lost as a handful of passengers in a great drifting ship. Well, I was, strangely, at the helm. Chapter 2. This came home to me when 2 days later I drove over with Flora to meet Mrs. Gross, as Mrs. Gross said, the little gentleman, and all the more for an incident that, presenting itself the second evening, had deeply concerted me. The first day had been, on the whole, as I have expressed, reassuring, but I was to see it wind up in keen apprehension. The post bag that evening, it came late, contained a letter from me which, however, in the hand of my employer, I found to be composed but of a few words enclosing another addressed to himself, with a seal still unbroken. This I recognize is from the headmaster, and the headmaster's an awful bore. Read him, please. Deal with him, but mind you don't report. Not a word. I'm off. I broke the seal with a great effort. So great a one that I was a long time coming to it. Took the unopened missive at the last up to my room, and only attacked it just before going to bed. I had better let it wait till morning, for it gave me a second sleepless night. With no counsel to take, the next day I was full of distress, and it finally got so the better of me that I determined to open myself at least to Mrs. Gross. What does that mean? The child dismissed his school. She gave me a look that I remarked at the moment, then, visibly, with a quick blankness, seemed to try to take it back. But aren't they all sent home? Yes, but only for the holidays. Miles may never go back at all. Consciously, under my attention, she reddened. They won't take him. They absolutely decline. At this she raised her eyes, which she had turned from me. I saw them fill with good tears. What has he done? I hesitated. Then I judged best to simply hand her my letter, which, however, had the effect of making her, without taking it, simply put her hands behind her. She shook her head sadly. Such things are not for me, miss. My counselor couldn't read. I winced at my mistake, which I attenuated as I could, and opened my letter again to repeat. I put it back in my pocket. Is he really bad? The tears were still in her eyes. Do the gentlemen say so? They go into no particulars. They simply express their regret that it should be impossible to keep him. That can have only one meaning. Mrs. Gross listened with dumb emotion. She forbore to ask me what this meaning might be, so that presently to put the thing with some coherence, and with the mere aid of her presence to my own mind. I went on that he's an injury to the others. At this, with one of the quick turns of simple folk, she suddenly flamed up. Master Miles? Him an injury? There was such a flood of good faith in it. that, though I had not yet seen the child, my very fears made me jump to the absurdity of the idea. I found myself, to meet my friend the better, offering it on the spot sarcastically to his poor little innocent mates. "It's too dreadful," cried Mrs. Gross, "to say such cruel things. Why, he's a scare 10 years old. Yes, yes, it would be incredible." She was evidently grateful for such a profession. "See him, miss, first, then believe it." I felt forthwith a new impatience to see him. It was the beginning of a curiosity that, for all the next hours, was to deepen almost to pain. Mrs. Gross was aware, I could judge, of what she had produced in me, and she followed it up with assurance. "You might as well believe it of the little lady. Bless her," she added the next moment. "Look at her." I turned and saw that Flora, whom 10 minutes before I had established in the schoolroom with a sheet of white paper, a pencil, and a copy of the nice round O's, now presented herself to the view at the open door. She expressed in her little way an extraordinary detachment from disagreeable duties, looking at me, however, with a childish light that seemed to offer it as a mere result of the affection she had conceived for my person, which she had rendered necessary that she should follow me. I needed nothing more than this to feel the full force of Mrs. Gross's comparison, and, catching my pupil in my arms, covered her with kisses, in which there was a sob of atonement. None the less, the rest of the day, I watched for further occasion to approach my colleague, especially as, toward evening, I began to fancy she rather sought to avoid me. I overtook her, I remember, on the staircase. We went down together, and at the bottom I detained her, holding her there with a hand on her arm. "I take what you said to me at noon as a declaration that you've never known him to be bad." She threw her head back. She had clearly, by this time, and very honestly, adopted an attitude. "Oh, never known him. I don't pretend that." I was upset again. "Then you have known him." "Yes, indeed, miss, thank God." On reflection, I accepted this. "You mean that a boy who never is no boy for me." I held her tighter. "You like them with the spirit to be naughty?" Then keeping pace with her, "So do I." I eagerly brought out. But not to the degree to contaminate. To contaminate, my big word left her at a loss. I explained it. To corrupt. She stared, taking my meaning in, but it produced in her an odd laugh. "Are you afraid he'll corrupt you?" She put the question with such a fine, bold humor that, with a laugh, as silly doubtless to match her own, I gave way for the time to the apprehension of ridicule. But the next day, as the hour for my drive approached, I cropped up in another place. "What was the lady who was here before? The last governess?" "She was also young and pretty, almost as young and almost as pretty, miss, even as you." "Ah, then I hope her youth and her beauty help her." I recollect throwing off. "He seems to like us young and pretty." "Oh, he did," Mrs. Gross assented. "It was the way he liked everyone." She had no sooner spoken, indeed, than she caught herself up. "I mean, that's his way, the master's." I was struck. "But of whom did you speak first?" She looked blank, but colored. "Why, of him." "Of the master? Of who else?" There was so obviously no one else that the next moment I had lost my impression of her having accidentally said more than she meant, and I merely asked what I wanted to know. Did she see anything in the boy? Wasn't right? She never told me. I had a scruple, but I overcame it. Was she particular? Mrs. Gross appeared to try to be conscientious. "About some things, yes, but not all." Again she considered. "Well, miss, she's gone. I won't tell tales." "I quite understand your feeling," I hastened to reply, but I thought it, after an instant, not opposed to this concession to pursue. "Did she die here?" "No, she went off." I don't know what to think. I don't know what there was in this brevity of Mrs. Gross's that struck me struck me as ambiguous. Went off to die? Mrs. Gross looked straight out of the window, but I felt that, hypothetically, I had a right to know what young persons engaged for Bly were expected to do. She was taken ill, you mean, and went home. She was not taken ill, so far as appeared, in this house. She left it at the end of the year to go home, as she said, for a holiday to which the time she had put in had certainly given her a right. We had then a young woman, a nursemaid who had stayed on and who was a good girl and clever, and she took the children altogether for the interval. But our young lady never came back, and at the very moment I was expecting her, I heard from the master that she was dead. I turned this over. But of what? He never told me. But please, said Mrs. Gross, I must get back to my work. Chapter 3. Her thus turning back on me was fortunately not just for my just preoccupations, a snub that would check the growth of our mutual esteem. We met, after I had brought home little Miles, more intimately than ever on the ground of my stupefaction, my general emotion. So monstrous was I, then ready to pronounce it, that such a child as had now been revealed to me should be under an interdict. I was a little late on the scene, and I felt, as he stood wistfully looking out for me before the door of the inn at which the coach had put him down, that I had seen him on the instant without and within, and the great glow of freshness, and the same positive fragrance of purity which I had, from the finest moment, seen his little sister. He was incredibly beautiful, and Mrs. Gross had put her finger on it. Everything but a sort of passion of tenderness for him was swept away by his presence. What I then and there took him to my heart was something divine that I have never found to the same degree in any child. His indescribable air of knowing nothing in the world but love. It would have been impossible to carry a bad name with greater sweetness of innocence, and by the time I had got back to Bly with him, I remained merely bewildered. So far, that is, I was not outraged by the sense of the horrible letter locked up in my room in a drawer. As soon as I could compass a private word with Mrs. Gross, I declared to her that it was grotesque. She promptly understood me. You mean this cruel charge? It doesn't live for an instant. My dear woman, look at him. She smiled at my pretension to have discovered his charm. I assure you, miss, I do nothing else. What will you say, then? She immediately added. In answer to the letter, I had made up my mind, nothing, and to his uncle, I was incisive, nothing, and to the boy himself, I was wonderful, nothing. She gave with her apron a great wipe to her mouth. Then I'll stand by you. We'll see it out. We'll see it out, I ardently echoed, giving her my hand to make a vow. She held me there a moment, then whisked up her apron again with her detached hand. Would you mind, miss, if I used the freedom to kiss me? No, I took the good creature in my arms, and after we had embraced like sisters, felt more fortified and indignant. This, at all events, was for the time, a time so full that, as I recall the way it went, it reminds me of all the art I now need to make a little distinct. What I took back with amazement is the situation I accepted. I had undertaken, with my compassion, to see it out. I was under a charm, apparently, that could smooth away the extent and the far and difficult connections of an effort. I was lifted aloft on a great wave of infatuation and pity. I found it simple, in my ignorance and confusion, and perhaps my conceit, to assume that I could deal with a boy whose education for the world was all on the point of beginning. I am unable to even remember at this day what proposal I framed for the end of his holidays and the resumption of his studies. Lessons with me, indeed, that charming summer, We all had a theory that he was to have, but now I feel that for weeks the lessons must have been rather my own. I learned something. At first, certainly, that had not been one of the teachings of my small smothered life, learning to be amused, and even amusing, and not to think for the morrow. It was for the first time, in a manner, that I had known space and air and freedom, all the music of the summer and the mystery of nature. And then there was consideration, and consideration was sweet. Oh, it was a trap, not designed, but deep into my imagination, to my delicacy, perhaps to my vanity, to whatever in me was most excitable. The best way to picture it all is to say that I was off guard. They gave me so little trouble, they were of a gentleness so extraordinary. I used to speculate, but even now with this dim disconnectedness, as to how the rough future, for all futures are rough, would handle them and might bruise them. They had the bloom of happiness and health, and yet, as if I had been in charge of a pair of little grandees, of princes of blood, for whom everything, to be right, would have to be enclosed and protected, the only form that in my fancy the after years could take for them was that of a romantic, a really royal extension of the garden and the park. It may be, of course, above all, what suddenly broke into this gives the previous time a charm of stillness, that hush in which something gathers or crouches. The change was actually like the spring of a beast. In the first weeks, the days were long. They often, at their finest, gave me what I used to call my own hour, the hour when, for my pupils, tea time and bedtime have come and gone, and I had, before my final retirement, a small interval alone. Much as I liked my companions, this hour was the thing in the day I liked the most. I liked it best of all when, as the light faded, or rather I should say, the day lingered, and the last call of the birds sounded in a flushed sky from the old trees, I could take a turn into the grounds and enjoy, almost with a sense of property that amused and flattered me, the beauty and dignity of the place. It was a pleasure at these moments to feel myself tranquil and justified, doubtless, perhaps, also to reflect, by my discretion, my good sense and general high propriety, as I was giving pleasure, if he ever thought of it, to the person whose pressure I had responded. What I was doing was what he had earnestly hoped and directed of me, and that I could, after all, do it, proved to an even greater joy than I had expected. I dare say I fancied myself, in short, a remarkable young woman, and took comfort in the faith that this would be more publicly appear. Well, I needed to be remarkable to offer a front to the remarkable things that presently gave their first sign. It was plump one afternoon in the middle of my very hour, and the children were tucked away, and I had come for my stroll. One of the thoughts that, as I don't in the least shrink now from noting, used to be with me in these wanderings, that it would be charming as a charming story suddenly to meet someone. Someone would appear there at the turn of the path, would stand before me and smile and approve. I didn't ask more than that. I only asked that he should know, that the only way to be sure he knew would be to see it, and the kind light of it in his handsome face. That was exactly present to me, by which I mean the face was, when on the first of these occasions, at the end of a long June day, I stopped short on emerging from the plantations and coming into the very view of the house. What arrested me on the spot, and with a shock much greater than any vision had allowed for, was the sense of my imagination, in a flash, turned real. He did stand there, but high up, beyond the lawn and at the very top of the tower to which, on that first morning, little Flora had conducted me. This flower was one of a pair, square, incongruous, crenellated structures that were distinguished for some reason, though I could see little difference, as the old and the new. They flanked opposite ends of the house and were probably architectural absurdities, redeemed in a measure, indeed, not by being wholly disengaged, nor of a height too pretentious, dating, in their gingerbread antiquity, from a romantic revival that was already a respectable past. I admired them, had fancies about them, for we could all profit in a degree, especially when they loomed through the dusk, by grandeur of their actual battlements. Yet it was not at such an elevation that the figure I had so often invoked seemed most in place. It produced in me, this figure, in the clear twilight, I remember two distinct gasps of emotion, which were sharply the shock of my first and that of my second surprise. My second was a violent perception of the mistake of my first. The man who met my eyes was not the person I had precipitately supposed. There came to me thus a bewilderment of vision, of which, after these years, there is no living view that I can hope to give. An unknown man in a lonely place is a permitted object of fear to a young woman privately bred, and the figure that faced me was, a few more seconds assured me, as little anyone else I knew. It was the image that had been in my mind. I had not seen it in Harley Street. I had not seen it anywhere. The place, moreover, in the strangest way in the world, that had, on instant, and by the very fact of its appearance, become a solitude. To me, at least, making my statement here with a deliberation which I have never made it, the whole feeling of the moment returns. It was as if, while I took it in, what I did take in, all the rest of the scene had been stricken with death. I can hear again, as I write, the intense hush in which sounds of evening dropped. The rook stopped cawing in the golden sky, and the friendly hour lost for the minute all its voice. But then there was no change in nature, unless indeed it were a change that I saw with stranger sharpness. The gold was still in the sky, the clearness in the air, and the man who looked at me over the battlements was as definite as a picture in the frame. That's how I thought, with extraordinary quickness, of each person that he might have been, and that he was not. We were confronted across our distance quite long enough for me to ask myself with intensity who, then, he was, and to feel, as an effect of my inability to say, a wonder that in a few instants more became intense. The great question, or one of these, is afterward, I know, with regard to certain matters, the question of how long they have lasted. Well, this matter of mine, think what you will of it, lasted while I caught at a dozen possibilities, none of which made a difference for the better, that I could see, and their having been in the house, and for how long, above all, a person of whom I was in ignorance. It lasted a while. I just bridled a little with the sense that my office demanded that there should be no such ignorance and no such person. It lasted while this visitant, at all events, and there was a touch of the strange freedom, as I remember, in the sign of familiarity of him wearing no hat, seemed to fix me from his position with just the scrutiny through the fading light that his own presence provoked. We were too far apart to call to each other, but there was a moment at which, at shorter range, some challenge between us, breaking the hush, would have been the right result of our straight mutual stare. He was in one of the angles, the one away from the house, very erect, as it struck me, and with both hands on the ledge. So I saw him as I see the letters I form on this page, then exactly after a minute, as if to add to the spectacle, he slowly changed his pace, passed, looking at me hard all the while, to the opposite corner of the platform. Yes, I had the sharpest sense that during this transit he never took his eyes from me, and I can see at this moment the way his hand, as he went, passed from one of the crenellations to the next. He stopped at the other corner, but less long, and even as he turned away, still markedly fixed me. He turned away. That was all I knew. Chapter 4. It was not that I didn't wait on this occasion for more, for I was rooted as deeply as I was shaken. There was a secret at Bly, a mystery of Adolfo, or an insane, unmentionable relative kept in an unsuspected confinement. I can't say how long it turned over, or how long, in confusion of curiosity and dread, I remained where I had had my collision. I only recall that when I re-entered the house, darkness had quite closed in. Agitation in the interval certainly had held me and driven me, for I must, in circling about the place, have walked 3 miles, but I was to be, later on, much more overwhelmed that this mere dawn of an alarm was a comparatively human chill. The most singular part of it, in fact, singular as the rest had been, was the part I became in the hall aware of and meeting Mrs. Gross. This picture comes back to me in the general train. The impression, as I received it on my return, of the wide, white, paneled space, bright in the lamplight, and with its portraits and red carpet, and of the good surprised look of my friend, which immediately told me she had missed me. It came to me straight away under her contact that, with plain heartiness, merely relieved anxiety at my appearance. She knew nothing whatever that could bear upon the incident that I had there ready for her. I had not suspected in advance that her uncomfortable face would pull me up, and somehow I measured the importance of what I had seen by thus finding myself hesitate to mention it. Scarce anything in the whole history seems to me so odd as this fact that the real beginning of the fear was one, as I may say, with the instinct of sparing my companion. On the spot, accordingly, in the pleasant hall, and with her eyes on me, for a reason that I couldn't then have phrased, achieved an inward resolution, offered a vague pretext for my lateness, and with the plea of the beauty of the night, and the heavy dew, and the wet feet, went as soon as possible to my room. Here it was another affair. Here, for many days after, it was queer affair enough. There were hours from day to day, or at least there were moments, snatched even from clear duties, when I had shut myself up to think. It was not so much that I was more nervous than I could bear, to be as that I was remarkably afraid of becoming so, for the truth I had now to turn over was simply and clearly the truth that I could arrive at no account whatever of the visitor with whom I had been so explicitly, and yet, it seemed to me, so intimately concerned. It took little time to see that I could stand without forms of inquiry, without exciting remarks, any domestic complications. The shock I had suffered must have sharpened all of my senses, I felt sure, at the end of 3 days, and as the result of mere closer attention, that I had not been practiced upon the servants, nor made the object of any game. Of whatever it was that I knew, nothing was known around me. There was but one sane inference. Someone had taken the liberty, rather gross. That was what, repeatedly, I dipped into my room and locked the door to say to myself. We had been, collectively, subject to an intrusion. Some unscrupulous traveler, curious in old houses, had made his way unobserved, enjoyed the prospect from the best point of view, then stolen out as he came. If he had given me such a bold and hard stare, that was but part of his indiscretion. The good thing, after all, was that we should surely see no more of him. This was not so good a thing, I admit, as not to leave me to judge what, essentially, made nothing else much signify simply my charming work. My charming work was just my life with Miles and Flora, and though I could do so, and though nothing I could do, so like it through the feeling I could throw myself into trouble. The attraction of my small charges was a constant joy, leading me to wonder afresh at the vanity of my original fears, the distaste I had begun by entertaining for probable grey prose of my office. There was to be no grey prose, it appeared, no long grind, so how could work not be charming that presented itself as daily beauty? It was all of the romance of nursery and all of the poetry of the schoolroom. I don't mean this, of course, that we studied only fiction and verse. I mean I can express no otherwise the sort of interest my companions inspired. How can I describe that except by saying that instead of growing used to them, and it's a marvel for a governess, I call the sisterhood to witness, I made constant fresh discoveries. There is one direction, assuredly, in which these discoveries stopped. Deep obscurity continued to cover the region of the boy's conduct at school. It had been promptly given to me, I have noted, to face that mystery without a pang. Perhaps even it would be nearer to the truth to say it without a word. He himself had cleared it up. He had made the whole charge absurd. My conclusion bloomed there with the real rose flush of his innocence. He was too fine and too fair for the little horrid, unclean school world, and he had paid a price for it. I reflected acutely that the sense of such differences, such superiorities of quality, always on the part of the majority, would always include even stupid, sordid headmasters, turn infallibly to the vindictive. Both the children had a gentleness, it was their only fault, and it never made Miles a muff, that kept them, how shall I express this, almost impersonal, and certainly quite unpunishable. They were like the cherubs of the antidote, who had, morally at any rate, nothing to whack. I remember the feeling with Miles in especial, as if he had had, as it were, no history. We expect of a small child a scant one, but there was in this little beautiful boy something extraordinarily sensitive, yet extraordinarily happy, that more than in any creature of his age I had seen, struck me as beginning anew each day. He had never for a second suffered. I took this as a direct disproof of him having really been chastised. If he had been wicked, he would have been caught. And I should have caught it by the rebound. I should have found the trace. I found nothing at all, and he was therefore an angel. He never spoke of his school, never mentioned a comrade or a master, and I, for my part, was quite too much disguised to allude to them. Of course I was under the spell, and the wonderful part is that even at the time I perfectly knew I was. But I gave up myself to it, and it was an antidote to any pain, and I had more pains than one. I was in receipt in these days of disturbing letters from home, where things were not going well. But my children, what things in the world mattered? That was the question I used to put to my scrappy retirements. I was dazzled by their loveliness. There was a Sunday to get on when it rained with such force and for so many hours that there could be no procession to church, in consequence of which, as the day declined, I had arranged with Mrs. Ghost that should the evening show improvement, we would attend the late service. The rain happily stopped, and I prepared for our walk, which, through the park and by the good road to the village, would be a matter of 20 minutes. Coming downstairs to meet my colleague in the hall, I remembered a pair of gloves that had required 3 stitches, and that had received them with a publicity perhaps not edifying, while I sat with the children at their tea, served on Sundays, by exception, in that cold, clean temple of mahogany and brass, the grown-up dining room. The gloves had been dropped there, and I turned in to recover them. The day was gray enough, but the afternoon light still lingered, and it enabled me, on crossing the threshold, not only to recognize on a chair near the wide window, then closed, the articles I wanted, but to become aware of the person on the other side of the window and looking straight in. One step into the room had sufficed. My vision was instantaneous. It was all there. The person looking straight in was the person who had already appeared to me. He appeared thus again, I won't say greater distinctness, but for that was impossible, but with a nearness that represented a forward stride in our intercourse and made me, as I met him, catch my breath and turn cold. He was the same, and seen, this time, as he had been seen before, from the waist up the window, through the dining room, was on the ground, not going down to the terrace on which he stood. His face was close to the glass, and yet the effect of this better view was, strangely, only to show me how intense the former had been. He remained but a few seconds, long enough to convince me that he also saw me and recognized, but it was as if I had been looking at him for years, and I had known him always. Something, however, happened this time that had not happened before. His stare into my face, through the glass and across the room, was as deep and as hard as then, but it quitted me for a moment, during which I could still watch it, see it fix successively several other things. On the spot there came to me the added shock of a certitude that was not for me. He had come there. He had come for someone else. The flash of this knowledge, for it was knowledge in the midst of dread, produced in me the most extraordinary effect. Started as I stood there, a sudden vibration of duty and courage. I say courage because I was beyond all doubt already far gone. I bounded straight out of the door again, reached that of the house, got in an instant upon the drive, and passing along the terrace as fast as I could rush, turned a corner and came full in sight. But it was in sight of nothing now. My visitor had vanished. I stopped. I almost dropped with the real relief of this, but I took in the whole scene. I gave him time to reappear. I call it time, but how long was it? I can't speak to the purpose today of the duration of these things. What kind of measure must have left me? They couldn't have lasted as they actually appeared to me last. The terrace and the whole place, the lawn and the garden beyond it, all I could see of the park were empty with a great emptiness. There were shrubberies and big trees. I remember the clear assurance that I felt none of them had concealed him. He was there or not there if I didn't see him. I got hold of this, then instinctively, instead of returning as I had come, went to the window. I was confusedly present. To me, I ought to place myself where he stood. I did so. I applied my face to the pane and looked, as he had looked, into the room, as if, at this moment, to show me exactly what his range had been. Mrs. Gross, as I had done for himself just before, came in from the hall. With this, I had the full image of repetition of what had already occurred. She saw me, and as I had seen my own visitant, she pulled up short as I had done. I gave her something of a shock that I had received. She turned white, and this made me ask myself if I had blanched as much. She stared, in short, and retreated on just my lines, and I knew she had passed out and come round to me, and that I should presently meet her. Where I remained was, and while I waited, I thought of more things than one. But there's only one I take space to mention. I wonder why she should be scared. Chapter 5. Oh, she let me know as soon as, round the corner of the house, she loomed in again into view. What, in the name of goodness, is the matter? She was now flushed and out of breath. I said nothing till she came quite near. With me? I must have made a wonderful face. Do I show it? You're white as a sheet. You look awful. I considered I would meet on this, without scruple, any innocence. My need to respect the bloom of Mrs. Gross's had dropped, without a rustle, from my shoulders, and if I wavered for an instant, it was not with what I kept back. I put my hand out to her, and she took it. I held her a little hard, liking to feel her close to me. There was a kind of support in the shy heave of her surprise. You came for me for church, of course, but I can't go. Has anything happened? Yes, you must know now. Did I look very queer? Through this window? Dreadful. Well, I said, I've been frightened. Mrs. Gross's eyes expressed plainly that she had no wish to be, yet also that she knew too well her place was not to be ready to share with me any marked inconvenience. Oh, it was quite settled that she must share. Just what you saw from the dining room a minute ago was the effect of that. What I saw just before was much worse. Her hand tightened. What was it? An extraordinary man looking in. What extraordinary man? I haven't the least idea. Mrs. Gross gazed around us in vain. Then where has he gone? I know still less. Have you seen him before? Yes, once, on the old tower. She looked at me harder. Do you mean he's a stranger? Oh, very much. Yet you didn't tell me? No, for reasons. But now that you've guessed, Mrs. Gross's eyes encountered this charge. I haven't guessed, she said, very simply. How can I if you don't imagine? I don't in the very least. You've seen him nowhere but on the tower and on this spot just now. Mrs. Gross looked again. What was he doing on the tower? Only standing there, looking down at me. She thought a minute. Was he a gentleman? I found I had no need to think. No, she said, gazed in deeper wonder. No. Then nobody found at the place? Nobody from the village? Nobody. I didn't tell you, but I made sure. She breathed a vague relief. This was, oddly, so much to the good. It only went indeed a little way. But if he isn't a gentleman, what is he? He's a horror. A horror? He's, God help me if I know what he is. Mrs. Gross looked round once more, and fixed her eyes on the duskier distance. Then, pulling herself together, turned to me with abrupt inconsequence. It's time. We should be at church. Oh, I'm not fit for church. Won't it do you good? I won't do them, I nodded at the house. The children, I can't leave them now. You're afraid? I spoke boldly. I'm afraid of him. Mrs. Gross's large face showed me at this for the first time, the faraway faint glimmer of a consciousness more acute. I somehow made out in the delayed dawn of an idea that I myself had not given her, and that was yet quite obscure to me. It comes back to me that I thought instantly of this as something I could get from her, and I felt it to be connected to the desire she presently showed to know more. When was it? On the tower? About the middle of the month, at this same hour. Almost dark, said Mrs. Gross. Oh, no, not nearly. I saw him as I see you. Then how did he get in? And how did he get out? I laughed. I had no opportunity to ask him. This evening, you see, I pursued, he has not been able to get in. He only peeps. I hope it will be confined to that. She had now let go of my hand and turned away a little. I waited an instant. Then I brought it out. To go to church. Goodbye. I must watch. Go to church. Slowly she faced me again. Do you fear for them? We met in another long look. Don't you? Instead of answering, she came nearer to the window and, for a minute, applied her face to the glass. You see how he could see, I meanwhile went on. She didn't move. How long was he here? Till I came out. I came to meet him. Mrs. Gross at last turned round, and there was still more in her face. I couldn't have come out. Neither could I laughed again. But I did come. I have my duty. So I have mine, she replied, which after she added, What is he like? I've been dying to tell you. But he's like nobody. Nobody? She echoed. He has no hat. Then in seeing her face that she has already in this, a deeper dismay found a touch of a picture. I quickly added stroke to stroke. His red hair, very red, close curling in a pale face, long in shape, with straight, good features and little, rather queer whiskers that are as red as his hair. His eyebrows are somehow darker. They look particularly arched, as if they might move a good deal. His eyes are sharp, strangely, awfully, but I only know that they're rather small and very fixed. His mouth's wide, and his lips are thin, and except for his little whiskers, he's quite clean-shaven. He gives me a sort of sense of looking like an actor. An actor? It was impossible to resemble one less, at least, than Mrs. Gross at that moment. I've never seen one, but I suppose them. He is tall, active, erect, I continued, but never a gentleman. My companion's face had blanched as I went on. Her eyes started and her mild mouth gaped. A gentleman, she gasped, confounded and stupefied. A gentleman he? You know him, then? She visibly tried to hold herself. But he is handsome. I saw the way to help her remarkably, and dressed in somebody's clothes. They're smart, but they're not his own. She broke into a breathless affirmative groan. They're the master's. I caught it up. You do know him. She faltered but a second. Quint, she cried. Quint? Peter Quint. His own man. His valet when he was here. When the master was? Gaping still but meeting me, she pieced it all together. He never wore his hat, but he did wear, well, there were waistcoats missed, and they were both here last year, when the master went and Quint was alone. I followed, but halting a little. Alone? Alone with us. Then from a deeper depth. In charge, she added. And what became of him? She hung fire so long that I was more mystified. He went, too. She brought out at last. Went where? Her expression at this became extraordinary. God knows where. He died. Died? I almost shrieked. She seemed fairly to plant herself more firmly, to utter the wonder of it. Yes, Mr. Quint is dead. Chapter 6. It took, of course, more than the particular passage to place us together in the presence of what we now had to live with as we could. My dreadful liability to impressions of the order so vividly exemplified, and my companion's knowledge, henceforth. A knowledge of half consternation and half compassion, that of liability. There had been, this evening, after the revelation left me, for an hour so prostrate, there had been, for either of us, no attendance on any service but a little service of tears and vows, of prayers and promises, a climax to the series of mutual challenges and pledges that had straightway ensued on our retreating together to the schoolroom and shutting ourselves up there to have everything out. The result of our having everything out was simply to reduce our situation to the last rigor of its elements. She herself had seen nothing, not the shadow of a shadow, and nobody in the house but the governess was in the governess's plight, yet she accepted without direct impunity my sanity, the truth as I gave it to her, and ended by showing me on this ground an awe-stricken tenderness, an expression of sense of my more than questionable privilege, of which the very breath has remained with me as that of the sweetest human charities. What is settled between us, accordingly, that night was that we might bear things together, and I was not even sure that, in the spite of her exemption, it was she who had the best of the burden. I knew at this hour, I think, as well as I know later, what I was capable of meeting to shelter my pupils, but it took with me some time to be wholly sure of what my honest Allie was prepared for to keep terms with so compromising a contract. I was queer company enough, quite as queer as the company I received, but as I trace over what we went through, I see how much common ground we must have had in the one idea that by good fortune could steady us. It was the idea, the second movement, that led me straight out, as I may say, of the inner chamber of my dread. I could take the air in the court, at least, and there Mrs. Gross could join me. Perfectly I can recall now the particular way the strength came to me before we separated for the night. We had gone over and over every feature of what I had seen. He was looking for someone else. You say, someone who was not you? He was looking for little Miles. A portentous clearness now possessed me. That's whom he was looking for. How do you know? I know. My exhaustion grew. And you know, my dear. She didn't deny this, but I felt not even so much as telling that. She resumed in a moment. At any rate, what if he should see him? Little Miles, that's what he wants. She looked immensely scared again. The child? Heaven forbid. The man, he wants to appear to them. That he might was an awful conception, and yet somehow I could keep it at bay, which, moreover, as we lingered there, was what I succeeded in practically proving. I had an absolute certainty that I should see again what I had already seen, but something within me said that by offering myself bravely as the sole subject of such an experience, by accepting, by inviting, by surmounting it all, I should serve as an expiatory victim and guard the tranquility of my companions. The children, in especial, I should thus fence about and absolutely save. I recall one of those last things I said that night to Mrs. Gross. It does strike me that my pupils have never mentioned... She looked at me hard as I musingly pulled up his having been here and the time they were with him. The time they were with him and his name and his presence and his history in any way. Oh, the little lady doesn't remember. She never heard or knew. The circumstances of his death? I thought with some intensity. Perhaps not, but Miles would remember. Miles would know. Oh, don't try him, broke from Mrs. Gross. I returned her the look she had given me. Don't be afraid, I continued to think. It is rather odd that he's never spoken of him, never by the least allusion, and you tell me that they were great friends? Oh, it wasn't him, Mrs. Gross with emphasis declared. It was at Quint's own fancy, to play with him, I mean, to spoil him. She paused a moment, then added, Quint was much too free. This gave me, straight from my vision of his face, such a face, a sudden sickness of disgust. Too free with my boy? Too free with everyone. I forbore, at the moment, to analyze this description further than by reflection that a part of it applied to several of the members of the household, of the half-dozen maids and men who were still of our small colony. But there was everything for our apprehension in the lucky fact that no discomfortable legend, no perturbation of scullions had ever, within anyone's memory, attached to the kind old place. It had neither a bad name nor ill fame, and Mrs. Gross most apparently only desired to cling to me to quake in silence. I even put her, the very last thing of it all, to the test. It was when, at midnight, she had her hand on the schoolroom door to take leave. I have it from you then. It's of great importance. And that he was definitely admittedly bad? Oh, not admittedly. I knew it. But the master didn't. And you never told him? Well, he didn't like tale-bearing. He hated complaints. He was terribly short with anything of that kind, and if the people were all right to him, he wouldn't be bothered with more. This squared well enough with my impressions of him. He was not a trouble-loving gentleman, nor very particular, perhaps, about some company he kept. All the same, I pressed my interlocutress. I promised you I would have told. She felt my discrimination. I dare say I was wrong, but really I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of things a man could do. Quint was so clever. He was so deep. I took this in still more than probably I should. You weren't afraid of anything else? Not his effect? His effect? She repeated with a face of anguish and waiting while I faltered. On innocent, precious lives. They were in your charge. No, they were not in mine, she roundly, distressfully returned. The master believed in him, and placed him here because he was supposed to not be well, and the country air was so good for him. So he had everything to say. Yes, she let me have it. Even about them. Them, that creature, I had to smother a kind of howl. And you could bear it? No, I couldn't, and I can't now. And the poor woman burst into tears. A rigid control from the next day was, as I have said, to follow them, yet how often and how passionately for a week we had come back together to the subject. Much we had discussed it that Saturday night. I was, in the immediate hours in the especial, for it may be imagined whether I slept, still haunted with the shadow of something she had not told me. I myself had kept nothing back. But there was a word Mrs. Gross had kept back. I was sure, moreover, by morning, that this was not a failure of frankness, because on every side there were fears. It seemed to me, indeed, in retrospect, that by the time the morrow's sun was high and I had restlessly read into the fact before us almost all of the meaning they were to receive from the subsequent and more cruel occurrences. What they gave me was above all was just the sinister figure of the living man. The dead one would continue a while, and of the months he had continuously passed by at Blythe, which, added up, made a formidable stretch. The limit of this evil time had arrived only when, on the dawn of winter's morning, Peter Quint was found, by a laborer going to work, stone dead, on the road from the village, a catastrophe explained, superficially at least, by a visible wound to his head, such a wound as might have been produced, and as on the final evidence had been, by a fatal slip in the dark, and after leaving the public house on the steepish, icy slope, a wrong path altogether, and at the bottom of which he lay. The icy slope, the turn mistaken at night, and in liquor accounted for much, practically, in the end, and after the inquest and boundless chatter, for everything, but there had been matters in his life, strange passageways and perils, secret disorders and vices, more than suspected, that would have accounted for a good deal more. I scarce know how to put my story into words that shall be a credible picture of my state of mind, but I was in these days literally able to find a joy in the extraordinary flight of heroism the occasion demanded of me. I now saw that I had been asked for a service admirable and difficult, and there would be a greatness in letting it be seen. Oh, in the right quarter. Oh, that I could succeed where many other girls have failed. It was an immense help to me. I confess, I rather applaud myself as I look back. I saw that my service was so strong and simple. I was there to protect and defend the little creatures in the world, and the most bereaved and most lovable, and the appeal of whose helplessness had suddenly become too explicit, a deep, constant ache for one's own committed heart. We were cut off, really, together. We were united in our danger. And they had nothing but me, and I had them. It was a magnificent chance. This chance presented itself to me in an image richly material. It was a screen. I was to stand before them. The more I saw, the less they would. I began to watch them in stifled suspense, a disguised excitement that might have had it continued too long, have turned into something like madness. What saved me, as I see, was that it turned into something else altogether. It didn't last as suspense. It was superseded by horrible proofs. Proofs, I say, yes, from the moment I really took hold. In the moment dated from an afternoon hour that I happened to spend in the grounds with the younger of my pupils alone, we had left Miles indoors, on the red cushion of a deep window seat. He had wished to finish a book, and I had been glad to encourage a purpose so laudable in a young man whose only defect was an occasional excess of restlessness. His sister, on the contrary, had been alert to come out, and I strolled with her half an hour seeking the shade, for the sun was still high in the day, exceptionally warm. I was aware afresh with her, as we went, of now, like her brother, she contrived, it was the charming thing in both children, to let me alone without appearing to drop me, and to accompany me without appearing to surround. They were never importunate, and never listless. My attention to them all really went into seeing them amuse themselves immensely without me. It was the spectacle they seemed to actively prepare that engaged me as an active admirer. I walked in a world of their invention. They had no occasion whatever to draw upon mine, so that the time was only taken with them being, for them, some remarkable person or thing that the game of the moment required, and that was merely thanks to my superior, my exalted stamp, a happy and highly distinguished signature. I forget what I was on the present occasion. I only remember that I was something very important and very quiet, and that Flora was playing very hard. We were on the edge of the lake, and as we had lately begun geography, the lake was the Sea of Azov. Suddenly, in these circumstances, I became aware that on the other side of the Sea of Azov, we had interested a spectator. The way of this knowledge gathered in me was the strangest thing in the world, the strangest, that is, except very much the stranger in which it quickly merged itself. I had sat down with a piece of work, for I was something or other that could sit on the old stone bench which overlooked the pond, and in this position I take in with certitude, and yet without direct vision, the presence at a distance of a third person. The old trees, the thick shrubbery, made a great and pleasant shade, but it was all suffused with the brightness of the hot, still hour. There was no ambiguity in anything, none whatever, at least, in the conviction I from one moment to another found myself forming as to what I could see straight before me and across the lake as a consequence of raising my eyes. They were attached at this juncture to the stitching in which I was engaged, and I can feel once more the spasm of my effort not to move them until I should have studied myself as to be able to make up my mind what to do. There was an alien object in view, a figure whose right of presence I instantly, passionately questioned. I recollect counting over perfectly the possibilities, reminding myself that nothing was more natural, for instance, than the appearance of one of the men about the place, or even of a messenger, a postman, or a tradesman's boy from the village. That reminder had little effect on my practical certitude, as I was conscious, still even without looking, of its having upon the character and attitude of our visitor. Nothing was more natural than these things that should not be other things that they are absolutely or not. The positive identity of the apparition I would assure myself as soon as the small clock of my courage should have ticked out at the right second. Meanwhile, with an effort that was already sharp enough, I transferred my eyes straight to little Flora, who, at the moment, was about 10 yards away. My heart had stood still for an instant with the wonder and terror of the question whether she too would see, and I held my breath while she waited. For what a cry from her, what a sudden, innocent sign, either of interest or of alarm, would tell me. I waited, but nothing came. Then, in the first place, and there is something more dire in this, I feel, than anything I have to relate, I was determined by a sense that within a minute all sounds from her had previously dropped, and, in the second, by the circumstance that also within the minute she had, in her play, turned her back to the water. This was her attitude when I last looked at her, looked with the confirmed conviction that we were still together under direct personal notice. She had picked up a small flat piece of wood, which happened to have in it a little hole that had evidently suggested to her the idea of sticking in another fragment that might figure as a mast and make the thing a boat. The second morsel, as I watched her, was she was very markedly and intently attempting to tighten in its place. My apprehension of what she was doing sustained me for so that some seconds I felt ready. I felt I was ready for more. Then again I shifted my eyes. I faced what I had to face. Chapter 7. I got a hold of Mrs. Gross as soon as after this as I could, and I gave no intelligible account of how I fought at the interval. Yet I still hear myself cry as I fairly threw myself into her arms. They know, it's too monstrous. They know. And what on earth? I felt her incredulity as she held me. Excuse me. Why, all that we know, and heaven knows what else besides. Then, as she released me, I made it out to her, and she made it out, perhaps only now with full coherency even to myself. 2 hours ago, in the garden, I could scarcely articulate. Flora saw. Mrs. Gross took as she might have taken a blow to the stomach. Has she told you? She panted. Not a word. That's the horror. She kept it to herself. That child of 8. That child. Unutterable still for me was the stupefaction of it. Mrs. Gross, of course, could only gape the wider. Then how do you know? I was there. I saw with my eyes. I saw that she was perfectly aware. Do you mean of him? No, of her. I was conscious as I spoke that I looked of prodigious things, for I got the slow reflection of them in my companion's face. Another time, this time, but a figure of quite unmistakable horror and evil, a woman in black, pale and dreadful, with an air also, and such a face. On the other side of the lake, I was there with the child, quiet for an hour. In the midst of it she came. Came how? From where? From where they come from. She just appeared and stood there, but not so near. And without coming nearer? Oh, for the effect and feeling, she might have been as close as you. My friend, with an odd impulse, fell back a step. Was she someone you've ever seen? Yes, but someone you've never seen? Yes, but the child has. Someone you have. Then to show how I had thought of it all. My predecessor, the one who died, Miss Jessel. You don't believe me? I pressed. She turned right and left in her distress. How can you be sure? This drew from me, in the state of my nerves, a flash of impatience. Then ask Flora. She's sure. But I had no sooner spoken than I caught myself up. No, for God's sake, don't. She'll say it isn't. She'll lie. Mrs. Gross was not too bewildered to instinctively protest. Ah, how can you? Because I'm clear. Flora doesn't want me to know. It's only then to spare you. No, there are depths. The more I go over it, the more I see in it. And the more I see in it, the more I fear. I don't know what I don't see, what I don't fear. Mrs. Gross tried to keep up with me. You mean you're afraid of seeing her again? No, that's nothing now. Then I explained it's of not seeing her, but my companion only looked wan. I don't understand you. Why, it's that the child may keep it up, that the child assuredly will without my knowing it. At the image of this possibility, Mrs. Gross for a moment collapsed, yet presently to pull herself together again, as if from the positive force of the sense of what, should we yield an inch, there would really be there to give way to. Dear, we must keep our heads. And after all, if she doesn't mind it. She even tried a grim joke. Perhaps she likes it. Like such things, a scrap of an infant. Isn't it just proof of her blessed innocence? My friend bravely inquired. She brought me, for the instant, almost drowned. Oh, we must clutch at that. We must cling to it. If it isn't proof of what you say, it's proof of God knows what. For the woman's a horror of horrors. Mrs. Gross at this fixed her eyes a minute on the ground, then at last raising them. "Tell me how you know," she said. "Then you admit it's what she was?" I cried. "Tell me how you know." My friend simply repeated, "No, by seeing her, by the way she looked." "At you, do you mean, so wickedly?" "Dear me, no, I could have borne that. She never gave me a glance, she only fixed the child." Mrs. Gross tried to see it. Fixed her? Ah, with such awful eyes. She stared at mine as if they really have resembled them. "Do you mean of dislike?" "God help us, no, of something much worse." "Worse than dislike?" This left her indeed at a loss, with a determination indescribable, with a kind of fury of intention. I made her turn pale. Intention? To get a hold of her. Mrs. Gross, her eyes just lingering on mine, gave a shudder and walked to the window, and while she stood there, looking out, I completed my statement. "That's what Flora knows." After a while she turned around. "The person was in black, you say? In mourning, rather poor, almost shabby, but yes, yes, with an extraordinary beauty." I now recognized what I had seen at last, stroke by stroke, brought the victim of my confidence, for she quite visibly weighed on this. "Oh, handsome, very, very," I insisted. "Wonderfully handsome, but infamous." She slowly came back to me. "Miss Jessel was infamous." She once took more of my hand in her own, holding it tight as if to fortify me against the increase of alarm I might draw from this disclosure. "They were both infamous," she finally said. And so for a little we faced it once more together, and I found absolutely a degree of help in seeing it now so straight. "I appreciate," she said, "the great decency of your not having hitherto spoken, but the time has certainly come to give me the whole thing." She appeared to assent to this, but only in silence, seeing which I went on. I must have it now. What did she die? Come, there was something between them. There was everything. In spite of the difference, of their rank, their condition, she brought it out woefully. She was a lady. I turned it over again. Yes, she was a lady. "And he so dreadfully below," said Mrs. Gross. I felt that I doubtless needn't press too hard in such company on the place of a servant in the scale, but there was nothing to prevent an acceptance of my companion's own measure of my predecessor's abasement. There was a way to deal with that, and I dealt the more readily for my full vision on the evidence of our employer's late clever, good-looking own man, impudent, assured, spoiled, depraved. The fellow was a hound. Mrs. Gross continued it as if perhaps a little case for sense of shades. "I never seen one like him. He did what he wished. With her, with them all." It was as if now in my friend's own eyes Mrs. Jessel had again appeared. I seemed, at any rate, for an instant, to see their evocation of her as distinctly as I had seen her by the pond, and I brought out decision. It must have been also what she wished. Mrs. Gross's face signified that it had been indeed, but she had said at the same time, "Poor woman, she paid for it." "Do you know what she died of?" I asked. "No, I know nothing. I wanted not to know. I was glad enough I didn't, and I thanked heaven that she was well out of this." "Yet you had, then, your idea of her real reason for leaving?" "Oh, yes, as to that, she couldn't have stayed. Fancy it here, for a governess, and I imagined, and I still imagine, and what I imagine is dreadful." "Not so dreadful as what I do," I replied, on which I must have shown her, as I was indeed but too conscious, a front of miserable defeat. It brought it all out again, her compassion for me. At the renewed touch of her kindness, my power to resist broke down. I burst, as I had the other time, made her burst into tears, and she took me to her motherly breast, and my lamentation overflowed. I don't do it, I sobbed in despair. I don't save or shield them. It's far worse than I dreamed of. They're lost. Chapter 8. What I had said to Mrs. Gross was true enough. There were in the matter I had put before her depths and possibilities that I lacked resolution to sound, so that when we were met once more in the wonder of it, we were of a common mind about the duty of resistance to extravagant fancies. We were to keep our heads, if we should keep nothing else. Difficult, indeed, as that may be in the face of what, in our prodigious experience, was least questioned. Late that night, while the house slept, we had another talk in my room, when she went all the way with me as to its being beyond doubt what I had seen exactly what I had seen. To hold her perfectly in the pinch of that, I found that I only had to ask her how, if I had made it up, came to be able to give of each person's appearing to me a picture of disclosing to the last detail their special marks, a portrait on the exhibition of which she had instantly recognized and named them. She wished, of course, small blame to her, to sink the whole subject, and I was quick to assure her that my own interests in it had now violently taken the form of a search for the way to escape from it. I encountered her on the ground of a probability that with recurrence we took for granted, I should get used to my danger, distinctly professing what my personal exposure had suddenly become the least of my discomforts. It was my new suspicion that was intolerable, and yet even to this complication the hours of the day had brought a little ease. On leaving her, after my first break, I had of course returned to my pupils, associating the right remedy for my dismay with that their sense of charm which I had already found to be a thing I could positively cultivate, and which had never failed me yet. I had simply, in other words, plunged afresh into Flora's special society, and there become aware, it was almost a luxury, that she would put her little conscious hand straight upon the spot that ached. She had looked at me in sweet speculation, and then had accused me to my face of having cried. I had supposed that I had brushed away the ugly signs, but I could literally, for the time, at all events, rejoice under this fathomless charity that they had not entirely disappeared. To gaze into the depths of the blue of the child's eyes and pronounce their loveliness a trick of premature cunning was to be guilty of a cynicism in which to which I naturally preferred to abjure my judgment and, so far as may be, my agitation. I couldn't abjure for merely wanting to, but I could repeat to Mrs. Gross, as I did there over and over in the small hours, that with their voices and their air, their pressure on one's heart, and their fragrant faces against one's cheek, everything fell to the ground but their incapacity and their beauty. It was a pity that somehow, to settle this once and for all, I had equally to re-enumerate the signs of subtlety that, in the afternoon, by the lake, had made a miracle of my show of self-possession. It was a pity to be obliged and reinvestigate the certitude of the moment itself and repeat how it had come to me as a revelation of the inconceivable communion that I then surprised was a matter for either party of habit. It was a pity that I should have had to quaver out again the reasons for my not having, and my delusion, so much as questioned that the little girl saw our visitant, even as I actually saw Mrs. Gross herself, and that she wanted, by just so much as she did thus see, to make me suppose she didn't, and at the same time, without showing anything, arrive at a guess as to whether I myself did. It was a pity that I needed once more to describe the portentous little activity by which she sought to divert my attention, The perceptible increase of movement, the greater intensity of play, the singing, the gabbling of nonsense, and the invitation to romp. Yet if I had not indulged, to prove there was nothing in it, in this review, I should have missed the 2 or 3 dim elements of comfort still remained to me. I should not, for instance, have been able to asseverate to my friend that I was certain, which I was so much to the good, that I, at least, had not betrayed myself. I should not have been prompted by stress of need, by desperation of mind, I scarce know what to call it, to invoke such further aid to intelligence as might spring from pushing my colleague fairly to the wall. She had told me bit by bit under pressure a great deal, but a small shifty spot on the wrong side of it all still sometimes brushed my brow like the wing of a bat, and I remember how on this occasion, for the sleeping house and the concentration alike of our dangers and our watch seemed to help, felt the importance of giving the last jerk to the curtain. I don't believe anything so horrible, I recollect saying. No, let us put it definitely, my dear, that I don't. But if I did, you know, there's a thing I should require now. Just without sparing you the least more of, oh, not a scrap, come, to get out of you what it was that you had in mind when, our distress before Miles came back over the letter from his school, you said, under insistence, that you didn't pretend for him, that he has not literally ever been bad. He has not literally ever, in these weeks that I have lived with him, so closely watched him, he has been an imperturbable little prodigy of delightful, lovable goodness. Therefore you might perfectly have made the claim for him if you had not, as it happened, seen an exception to take. What was your exception, and to what passage in your personal observation of him did you refer? It was a deadly austere inquiry, but the levity was not our note, and at any rate, before the grey dawn admonished us to separate, I had got my answer. What my friend had in mind proved to be immensely to the purpose. It was neither more nor less than the circumstances that for a period of several months Quint and the boy had been perpetually together. It was, in fact, the very appropriate truth that she had ventured to criticize the propriety, to hint at the incongruity of so close an alliance, and even go so far as on the subject of a frank overture to Miss Jessel. Miss Jessel had, with a most strange manner, requested her to mind her business, and the good woman had, on this, directly approached little Miles. What she had said to him, I since pressed, was that she liked to see young gentlemen not forget their station. I pressed again, of course, at this. You remind him that Quint was only a base menial, as you might say, and it was his answer, for one thing, that was bad, and for another thing? I waited. He repeated your words to Quint? No, not that. It's just what he wouldn't. She still could impress upon me. I wasn't sure, at any rate, she added, that he didn't. But he denied certain occasions. What occasions? When they had been out and about together, quite as if Quint was his tutor, and a very grand one, and Miss Jessel only for the little lady. When he had gone off with the fellow, I mean, and spent hours with him. Then he prevaricated about it. He said he hadn't. Her assent was clear enough to cause me to add in a moment, I see. He lied. Oh, Mrs. Gross mumbled. This was a suggestion that it didn't matter, which indeed she backed up by further remark. You see, after all, Mrs. Jessel didn't mind. She didn't forbid him. I considered. What did he put it to you as a justification? At this she stopped again. No, he never spoke of it. ever mentioned her in connection with Quint? She saw, visibly flushing, where I was coming out. Well, he didn't show anything. He denied. She repeated. He denied. Lord, how I pressed her now, so that you could see that what was between the two wretches. I don't know, the poor woman groaned. You do know, my poor thing, I replied, only you haven't my dreadful boldness of the mind, and you keep back out of timidity and modesty, and delicacy, even with the impression that in the past, when you had, without my aid, to flounder about in silence, most of all made you miserable. But I shall get it out of you yet. There was something in the boy that suggested to you, I continued, that he covered and concealed their relation. Oh, he couldn't prevent your learning the truth, I dare say, but heavens, I fell with vehemence, a-thinking, it shows that they must, to that extent, have succeeded in making of him. Ah, nothing's of that not nice now, Mrs. Gross lugubriously pleaded. I don't wonder you to look queer. I persisted. When I mentioned to you the letter from his school, I doubt if I looked as queer as you, she retorted with homely force, and if he was so bad, then as that comes to, how is he such an angel now? Yes, indeed. And as if he was a fiend at school, how? Well, I said in my torment, you must put it to me again, but I shall not be able to tell you for some days. Only put it to me again, I cried in a way that made my friend scare. There are directions in which I must not for the present let myself go. Meanwhile, I returned to her first example, the one to which she had just previously referred, of the boy's happy capacity for an occasional slip. If Quint, on your remonstrance, at the time you speak of, was a base menial, one of the things Mild said to you, I find myself guessing, was that you were another. Again, her admission was so adequate that I continued, and you forgave him that. Wouldn't you? Oh, yes. And we exchanged there, in the stillness, a sound of the oddest amusement. Then I went in. At all events, while he was with the man, Miss Flora was with the woman. It suited them all. It suited me, too, I felt, only too well, by which I mean that it suited exactly the particularly deadly view that I was in the act of forbidding myself to entertain. But I so far succeeded in checking the expression of this view that I will throw just here no further light on it than I may be offered by the mention of my final observation of Mrs. Gross. His having lied and been impudent are, I confess, less engaging specimens than I had hoped to have from you in the outbreak of him, the little natural man. Still, I mused, they must do, for they must make me feel more than ever I must watch. It made me blush for the next minute to see in my friend's face how much more unreservedly she had forgiven him, than her own antidote struck me as presenting my own tenderness an occasion for doing. This came out when at the schoolroom door she quitted me. Surely you don't accuse him of carrying on an intercourse that he conceals from me? Ah, remember that, until further evidence, I now accuse nobody. Then, before shutting her out to go by another passage to her own place, I must just wait, I wound up.